What's going on, everybody? Hope you're having a good week. So, Capcom just released 12 minutes of Resident Evil 4 Remake gameplay. The Resident Evil 4 Remake is just a month away, and I haven't talked about it on my channel yet, mainly because I was one of the people that didn't think Resident Evil 4 needed a remake. Since I was like 6 years old, I loved Resident Evil. It is actually my all-time favorite franchise, like movie franchise, video games, book franchise. Anything Resident Evil, I just eat it up. And I started a few communities out there that has about 2K followers, and I did all that because I love Resident Evil so dang much. So you can imagine my reaction when, instead of coming out with a Resident Evil Code Veronica remake, which is in fact my all-time favorite in the series, but instead got a Resident Evil 4 remake. Not only the best Resident Evil game, but one of the best video games of all time, one of the most revolutionary video games of all time, making the over-the-shoulder gameplay a staple in video games. And I remember as a kid, the first time I played Resident Evil 4, it was on the Nintendo GameCube, and a friend had it. And at first, when he showed it to me, I didn't recognize it because the over-the-shoulder gameplay threw me off, and I sort of doubted the horror aspect of it. But after playing that first village mission and seeing how the horror in Resident Evil 4 was perfectly blended with the action, I was quick to turn into a huge fan of that game. And I feel like there were a lot of low-key Resident Evil fans at the time before Resident Evil 4 came out, but after Resident Evil 4, a ton of fans started to get extremely into the franchise. And then the movie started to be more and more ridiculous. And so it was clear after Resident Evil 4, that's when the craze really started. Sure, there were the Outbreak 1 and 2 times, and I was playing that game as well with a couple friends, and I just love the hell out of the Outbreak games. Resident Evil 4 changed everything for the franchise, no doubt. And so now seeing a humongous project like Resident Evil 4 Remake, and I'm sure it's not as big as I think, or anybody thinks for that matter, because the nostalgia for that game is as big for a game like Metroid Prime or the original Super Mario Brothers. So seeing a remake of a game that is this important, of course, makes me mostly cautious because I'm not going to get my hopes up too high. If I were to realistically gauge my hopes in any way, I would say the game is going to be as good as Resident Evil 2 Remake, if not a little bit better with the tweaks they're making to the gameplay. But even with Resident Evil 2 Remake, I'm a big fan of the old school games as well, but I mostly started paying attention around Code Veronica. So when Resident Evil 2 Remake came out, I mostly thought, oh boy, I can't wait to re-experience this city with new polished graphics and gameplay because I've been waiting for an over-the-shoulder horror Resident Evil game. And with Capcom releasing that 12-minute Chapter 5 gameplay, I'm still cautiously excited because there are a few things that I don't like in the remake. I feel like there are some elements that prevent it from being as fast-paced as the original, namely what people are talking about the most, the rain gate. I understand in Chapter 5, that's around the time where the game gets a little scarier and the environment becomes more obstructed on purpose, so I understand the rain being so in your face to try to make everything a little more dicey in some situations. But it just seems like it's going to be more annoying and distracting. So that's one thing I'm worried about a tiny bit. I feel like they're going to overuse the rain like they did in Resident Evil 2. It's like Dev Team 1 just loves rain effects, and it seems like they think it makes things more detailed, or as if there's some kind of thing wrong with the RE engine, like if objects weren't shiny, they wouldn't look good in the RE engine, because even though it didn't rain in Resident Evil 3 Remake, it looked like it just rained. Like everything was shiny for no reason. So I feel like Dev Team 1 just loves the rain effects on the RE engine, and they love the shininess of it because it adds more realism and believability while it's raining. And especially if you're in a rural village with dirt around you and wood and trees, it's not going to look very shiny. And if it does, it's going to end up like the outside of the orphanage in Resident Evil 2 looking a little jank with its shine a little too shiny for no reason. So I guess they wanted to make the rain effects kind of dynamic in a way, or just stand out so it distracts you from the dreariness of the environments. And that's why they also added the smoke effect on the ground in some areas, which is strange, but it looks cool. But it also looks very random that they have smoke effects on the ground. And it seems like that's going to also obstruct you from finding certain items if you're going to break barrels like you did in Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, and even 7. So it just seems like some of these environmental elements are going to get in the way of the immersion, I guess, which is strange because usually the environments engross you more in the game. But it seems like these are going to pull you out. So that's something I'm not particularly looking forward to. And I am also worried about it. So I think that's an actual negative from what I can tell. And I just hope it doesn't rain too much in the game. And maybe Dev Team 1 at Capcom just doesn't like how the game looks naturally, or they're trying to hide something or some kind of detail that they changed, which could be a very, very good thing. And yes, of course, I'm excited because I want to re-experience all of those incredible moments of Resident Evil 4, and they're still incredible. I'm still playing Resident Evil 4 VR on the Quest 2. But yeah, they seem to change certain things in the remake, like Ashley Graham's appearance. Of course, they updated it to be a little more culturally sound, if I may. And the Ganados pretty much look the same. They're just a bunch of old men and women running after you. And I hope that they just don't have the same 5 models for them like they did in the original. I hope they actually mix them up and there's creepier versions or even more infected versions of the Ganados, as if the infection is taking over their body slowly. Besides the cultists, I would like to see different types of Ganados. And also, it would be amazing if they sort of had the same nature to the Ganados like they did with the zombies, where you shoot them in the head like 10 times, then come back 2 hours later and they're still alive. Just imagine if Leon suplexes a Ganado and you think he's dead because he dropped his item, and then you come back and he sneaks up on you and turns out to be still alive, but with a broken neck, and just scares the crap out of you. I would love that. That would add so much horror to it, and it would be a perfect callback to Resident Evil 2 Remake, because as you know, this is the same team that did Resident Evil 2 Remake. Now, something else that worries me a tiny bit is the Ada storyline. Now, I'm excited about the changes that are going to happen with the Ada and Leon story, because I just straight up didn't like it in the original Resident Evil 4. I thought Leon's approach to Ada and the way he handled that was just mundane and boring. He just said a couple of cool lines and they moved on, when I feel like Ada and Leon have so much to talk about and so much to resolve. So seeing them have that appropriate interaction reflected off of what happened in Resident Evil 2 Remake would be incredible. That's what I'm looking forward to the most. But it also worries me because it could be the case where they don't add a separate ways DLC, but they intertwine Ada's story into Leon's, just like with Ashley Graham's gameplay in that one section. And I'm sure that doesn't make any sense to you, because Ashley Graham had gameplay intertwined, but only one part. And it was a pretty good part, all things considered. Originally in the European version of Resident Evil 4, that was supposed to be a callback to the original Resident Evil games, and the camera was actually supposed to be fixed. So that's the reason why they changed it to an unequipped character like Ashley Graham, and that's the reason why she had that auto aim mechanic with the lamps in that section, because you weren't supposed to be aiming in the first place. But they just thought that Americans weren't gonna like it because we complained so hard about the fixed camera apparently, but I love the fixed camera. I would have completely ate that part up if I played the European version originally as a kid. And of course, they're probably not going to have that kind of callback in the remake, but having Ada's story intertwined with Leon's, like Ashley kind of did, is just going to throw a wrench in the perfect pacing that Resident Evil 4 had. And sure, you think more characters, more gameplay, that's just a good thing, but it's actually not. If I look at a game like the original Ninja Gaiden 2, that game was pretty much perfect to me. And then in Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2, you play as 2 other characters, and that just throws the whole game off. That's usually the time where I stop playing the game, because I want to play as Ryu Hayabusa. I don't want to play as Momoji or Ayane. I want to play as Ryu. So to play as Ada instead of Leon all the time, or maybe more than once, if she has a big enough story like in the original Resident Evil 4, is just going to make the pacing of the main story and missions a bit off compared to the original, and that's going to hurt the game in the long run, I feel. And I also feel like they're going to mess with the story to a point that Ada is going to save Leon and Leon's not going to save Ada, which I'm okay with, because Ada is the more seasoned agent, and it only makes sense because she started saving him before. But there are no doubt going to be a lot of people that are going to complain about the story changes because it's going to be more culturally appropriate. Besides that, there are a slew of changes with the equipment the gameplay, and everything that Capcom unveiled to us. And I love how at the beginning of the change list, they said, we didn't want to do this remake. I just think they're such G's for saying that, and they're pretty cool to have that freedom to actually word out their opinion in a technical list. But they said that there were going to be charms with the cases, and you could actually collect different cases. So you can have different weapon loadouts, which is kind of cool and very modern of them to put it in there. You can apparently have a golden case and an ammunition charm. I'm assuming that's going to affect the amount of ammunition you pick up. So you're going to have all these customizable cases, and they're going to expand that even more. But here's the thing about survival horror. I think when you add too many elements, it gives people the opportunity to manipulate it to the point that it doesn't become survival horror anymore. It just becomes a kill fest, and you're the main character from Dead Alive. And if you've seen that movie, comment down below because we have something to talk about. Now, I'm a gigantic survival horror fan. I play Resident Evil 2 almost every single week just to get my spirits up. And it's weird playing a survival horror game just to get your spirits up, but I feel like Resident Evil 2 Remake is my all-time favorite game ever made. The way it looks, the way it plays, the storyline, the voice acting, the graphics, the writing, everything about that game to me is perfect, and it's the golden standard to any Resident Evil that comes out in the future. And the fact that Dev Team 1, the guys that worked on Resident Evil 2 Remake, is working on this, and they have pretty much completed it. It gets me excited to the point that I can't really react, because if I do, I'm going to go crazy. I think I'm at a point where I can control my excitement. So my excitement for this is the span of 25 years of Resident Evil, collecting all of the strategy guides, Resident Evil Archive 1 and 2, hell, making my own strategy guides, printing the original script of the George A. Romero Resident Evil and reading every single page, collecting all the S.D. Perry books. And there are some people on YouTube that quote the S.D. Perry books a little too much. I think S.D. Perry is a great author. Now, there were a lot of mistakes in the book with continuity, so I didn't really follow the books like it was the Bible. But all things considered, with the Resident Evil storyline, I'm kind of a know-it-all when it comes to the series. So seeing developments in Resident Evil 3 Remake, like Nemesis infecting zombies as if they were ganados, or having some kind of parasite, which sort of strings back to Lisa Trevor and the fact that she had the Nemesis parasite inside of her, was kind of awesome, and it checked out. And I like any kind of development in the Resident Evil story, like with Resident Evil 8 and how they linked Oswald E. Spencer to the village, and pretty much the whole link was just the idea and the symbol for Umbrella. That's about it. They didn't really link anything. It's sort of convoluted to the point of nonsense. But I hope we will get actual developments in the Resident Evil 4 story, unlike the entirety of the original. Even the notes and diaries that you find in the original have pretty much nothing to do with the old games or anything in the future. It's just its own contained story. It sort of doesn't even feel like Resident Evil. I feel like Shinji Mikami just wanted to make The Evil Within 0.5 instead of Resident Evil 4 whenever I play that game. But I hope with the new revision and the new remake that we will actually see some connection to the originals, more so than just an intro that tells you, oh yeah, by the way, all of that Raccoon City stuff is over and we're moving on to a new storyline. Because I feel like that's just spitting in the face of the fans, people like me that invested so much time in the storyline. And at least they closed that storyline down for a new one, but the new one with 4, 5, and 6 was not arguably the weakest of all these semi-trilogy storylines. I think that 7, 8, and potentially 9 is the second strongest next to the original. But let's just hope that Resident Evil 4 Remake actually adds the essence of the older games and their stories to the new remake, because I'm really hoping that it steers and refreshes the franchise enough to not only have a great Resident Evil 9, but to have even better remakes and sequels for the original characters too. I want to see Leon come back with another legendary sequel like 2 and 4, because Resident Evil 6 was kind of a fluke in the way that they portrayed Leon kind of being ignorant, even though he's been in the game for a while. No pun intended. Leon is a completely seasoned and all-knowing character. The way they portrayed him in Eternal Darkness was appropriate. I actually liked that Leon that they showed. He was mysterious and he knew a lot of secrets. I want to see that potential conclude in an appropriate way, instead of the weird way that it concluded in Resident Evil 6, where it wasn't really a suitable ending for Ada and Leon. It was just a text that she sent them saying, "I see you, boo." It would be awesome if Ada helped Leon catch Wesker, or if she had something to do with Wesker's capture, because they just so happened to find him. It was a coincidence, and Ada really had no substantial role in catching the big bad guy in Resident Evil 5. There are also other characters that could come back in Resident Evil 4 Remake and that could have an actual storyline, and I just want them to have it, namely Hunk. I want him to have a good role in it. I want him to not only have a good role in Resident Evil 4 Remake, but to tease Code Veronica, because he does have connections to Alfred Ashford as well. They could easily make an extra mode or story like they did with Resident Evil 2 that adds Hunk into the mix, because it threw me off so much when Hunk was only included in Mercenaries and he didn't actually get his own mission like he did with Resident Evil 2. And because there were different directors working on multiple Resident Evils, sometimes one Resident Evil would start a storyline and it would just go nowhere, like even with Albert Wesker. In Resident Evil 5, the only enlightening thing that happened to Albert Wesker was a rocket to the face. Eventually, he just became any old bad guy like Oswald E. Spencer. Apparently, they even simplified him in Resident Evil 5, which was a real bummer. I get that all he wanted to do was become a god, but there were so many intricacies in the story, and when it all came down to it, 4, 5, and 6 all had the burden to conclude that convoluted storyline, and they didn't. So for me personally, Resident Evil 4 is carrying the burden of a lot of unresolved questions. Because of all of the diaries that we read in the previous ones, we have a ton of questions that we wanted answered. And sure, not everything could be exposition, but what I'm not liking about the new Resident Evil games, which is strange because they're so good, but the only thing I'm not liking about the new Resident Evil games is the fact that you have this entire game to develop some kind of story with a cutscene to explain something about what's happening. But instead, you just fight a bunch of bad guys. The big bad guy just says a typical thing like, "I will rule the world," or something or another. And then you get put into this room with like 50 books that you have to read, full of exposition of the stuff you actually want to know about. And I feel like instead of doing that, these Resident Evil games should just have flashbacks like they did with Resident Evil 2 that showed William Birkin trying to fight Umbrella's secret military. And yes, there were games like Umbrella Chronicles that answered a lot of those questions. But again, Umbrella Chronicles just ended with a shootout and a typical last boss action scene where he has the ultimate weapon and you have approximately 6 minutes to destroy this weapon or the entire world will be annihilated or something or the other. And it's just so typical. It kind of feels like a superhero movie when Resident Evil was so much more than that. It used to be all of these branching paths and all of these possibilities that you can have with each character. Even the original Resident Evil 3 had multiple endings. And then after you finish the game, completing certain criteria, you get an extension of all of the main characters' whereabouts and what they're up to. And I just want a new Resident Evil game to do that. I want them to care about what came before and what's coming after. I feel like Resident Evil 2 Remake was really the only Resident Evil game to do that in a long time. Even Resident Evil 3 Remake sort of just didn't care about all the branching paths and different characters. Not entirely. All it did was care about the clout that Resident Evil 2 Remake gave it. And I want Resident Evil 4 to not only extend the universe to a promising future, but I want it to also reference the past appropriately and tie up some of those loose ends that we never got the answer to. Like, where the heck is Hunt? Why haven't they shown him for so long? Is he dead? I guess he isn't Mr. Death anymore. It's sort of starting to feel redundant with all of the branching paths that they're creating with Alex Wesker, Oswald E. Spencer, Albert Wesker, the BSAA, and all of these new names that they keep on coming up with, like Tricell, TerraSave, and the fact that they're almost always funded by these corrupt companies. And they expect us to be surprised about this when this has been the same storyline since Resident Evil 5. And I just hope that Resident Evil 4 breaks away from this, because that is the only crutch that Resident Evil has been having. And I get that there's always a veil over these typical things and these big corporations that only want money and power, but there has to be something more. And I understand that Mother Miranda wanted more, but she just ended up being a typical bad guy too. I just hope they won't go too simple with Resident Evil 4 Remake and that they actually make the story a lot better without messing up the pacing. And I get that's a lot to ask for, but this is a remake of the biggest game in history. I mean, for goodness sakes, they're still selling with the original game. The Meta Quest 2 did so well because Resident Evil 4 VR came with it, or was available for it if you didn't get the bundle. But yeah, besides that, as you can tell, my hopes for Resident Evil 4 are extremely high because this, to me, is pretty much like an Ocarina of Time remake. I want it to be absolutely perfect, and I want them to add what they should have back then. A lot of people think that Resident Evil 4 is a 10 out of 10 game. I think the gameplay is 10 out of 10. I think the story is more like a 7. I feel like they could crank it up to 11 and they could make the storyline a lot better. They could make the atmosphere a lot better. It seems like they are doing that to a point of maybe 11 is too high. Maybe you want to wind it down to 9 for the environment because it's just a little too much. And I really hope that this game works on the Steam Deck because I would absolutely love to play the Resident Evil 4 remake on the go whenever I have to pick somebody up or do errands. But yes, for me, there is a lot riding on this remake, and that's the reason why I can't look forward to it too much or even think about it too much. I can't get my hopes too high because if I do get my hopes as high as they were for Resident Evil 5 and 6, and with everything I've experienced in video games, I'm either going to hate it or absolutely love it. And I used to be a big sucker for Resident Evil games. Every year they would make a new one like Resident Evil 6, and I ate those games up for sure, just like the movies. I always loved the movies, even though everyone else hated them, and I understood why they hated them. They were so bad. But it was definitely a guilty pleasure series for me for a long time, and the games were everything to me. They were the only game I was playing for a long time. I don't even know how many hours I put into them, and it wasn't only about speed running. When I had a community, they would always talk about speed running all the time, and I thought, why would you want to speed run through this beautiful game when they worked so hard on the environments? And obviously they made the environments really well, but I think the speed running aspect and obsession comes from the fact that it's not very easy to traverse through these stages and environments that they made for the game. So I purposefully take my time with all these games. So when a game like Resident Evil 6 comes out, when you have to speed through everything and just pretty much run through the game and at a high octane speed of 200 miles per hour sometimes, it sort of throws me off and it kind of makes me uncomfortable to play it because I'm not used to no backtracking in a Resident Evil game. But Resident Evil 4, I really hope that the environments are more interesting and actually enable people to backtrack more often. They could even double the gameplay by making the environment slightly different when you go back. And I know that it did it before in certain areas, but not a lot of people backtrack in Resident Evil 4. And the main thing I loved about that game was the action. But all the other games, to me, pay attention to the details more, and that's what I want Resident Evil 4 Remake to do. It has the graphical engine, and the developers have the experience to make it not only extremely fun like the original game was, but as interesting as the Resident Evil 2 Remake, and as immersive as it as well. And that would just be a 10 out of 10 game if they get the storyline correct, the action and pacing correct, and the environments like the original and the games before it did. So yeah, I am worried about Resident Evil 4 Remake, and it's just strange how there are some people out there that sort of see worrying as a sign of weakness when it's actually just showing care for something that you love. And I more than love Resident Evil. Resident Evil at some point when I was a kid was my entire life. The first thing I typed down on my old Windows 95 computer was Resident Evil. The first thing I ever drew was a Resident Evil comic. That and Dragon Ball was the beginning of my creative life. So seeing a realistic remake of it just feels weird. I put so much time into the series that I felt like I should have made it. But I know it's like a Japanese thing, so I guess they're like the only guys that could do an American-based English first language video game, but it's okay. I'm sort of more envious that I wasn't able to make that remake. And I know that's a lot to think of yourself, but growing up, all you had were your skills and your talent. And so I kind of thought a lot about that, and I didn't just grow up to think, oh, I can't wait to play Resident Evil 18. I kind of grew up to think, boy, I wish I could make a Resident Evil game at some point or have something to do with it. But it is really cool to be able to play this. And on a creative level, I am worried about it because when it comes to remakes, they change a lot. They change everything, and taking anything away from the most important game in history could alter how you think about the old one. And that's sort of messing with time if you think about it. I can't help but feel mortified whenever I see gameplay of it. And I just don't want to see anything besides those 12 minutes of Chapter 5 because I want to be completely surprised by any changes they have from this point on. I'm willing to wait all this time without even looking at any more screenshots, articles, trailers, or anything else related to it. I don't want to spoil anything else, even though I know this game like the back of my hand. This will probably, for me, be the last video I make on Resident Evil Remake. But yeah, let me know what you guys think about the upcoming Resident Evil 4 remake. Let me know if you like the idea of Capcom remaking a classic and legendary game like Resident Evil 4. And what do you think about those rain effects too? Do you think that's going to kill the nighttime sequences? Are you a big fan of Resident Evil? Have you been following it since you were a kid and obsessing over the storyline and games like I have? Have you made a Resident Evil script at some point like I did? But have you made any kind of fan fiction or storyboard of some sort for this franchise? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you're having a great week. See you guys next one. Later.